I find myself getting
You usually record
getting
questions?
pulled together. Yeah, two
Questions?
different calls.
Yeah.
Oh, you do?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right.
Now, they didn't always.
Okay. So let's pull out our questions for chapter 18, and we'll start from there. How about Jane? If I start with you, would you take number 1, please?
Okay. What does it mean when verse 1 says, "The soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David"? How have some people chosen to understand that? An incredible close friendship was formed where they regarded each other more highly than they regarded themselves. Some choose to regard this as a homosexual relationship just to justify their own proclivities.
There you go. Anyone else have anything? That's perfect. I think too, just to add to that, we talked last week about the fact that this was a supernatural thing, that God actually provided this knitting together. This isn't something that would happen on the natural. More than likely, this is something that God would have knit together.
Right.
So,
I had on that they both had a great love for God, which made them, their love for each other even stronger.
yeah, absolutely. And isn't that the truth, though, even today, with friendships?
He was, Jonathan was Saul's son.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he like going against his dad.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And Jonathan was older than David, and so we don't know exactly how much older, but we believe probably somewhere around 8 to 10 years older is the best guess. And so it's something that God actually wove together to be used together for His purposes.
Can I had a thought on that.
Yes, please.
Anyway, they talked about wrapped together like a bundle of kindling firewood, Anyway, the term bound together anyway. But I was thinking, God calls David a man after God's own heart.
Yes.
And David was married to Michal and then Abigail.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I was thinking Michal would have been Jonathan's sister, right?
Uh-huh. Yes.
Okay.
At least half-sister. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And this is the bloodline of the Messiah. And so for this to be, attractive or
Sinful.
yeah, sinful, to me would not be likely because of the, anyway.
Because of the bloodline of Jesus.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Being polluted.
That would be a good thing
Right.
that you could argue against for those who try and make it something.
Yeah, and
yeah.
I thought about and prayed about it a lot. And
Right.
so, thinking about that.
Right. Well, we talked about the fact that story has been around for centuries.
Right.
There's artwork back. I think the earliest picture I saw, and it may go back further. That just is what I saw, was 1290. Medieval art talking about that type of relationship between Jonathan and David. But throughout history, people have been more accepting at different periods of time of those relationships, almost accepting them as normal. So yeah, but I mean, it was a common thing to have, and so it maybe it didn't seem so ungodly to them. I don't know exactly how that all got going, but it certainly is something that from a God perspective would be an
Doesn't make
abomination
sense.
and doesn't make any sense. That's a
No,
good
it
point. Good point.
And on what she was saying, as we're studying about David and about his life, is to keep upmost, for me, I'm only talking about for myself, is that this is the bloodline of God.
Yes.
This is where Jesus comes through.
That's
Exactly.
And I have to say that to myself, or not get into the story form of it as much as this is
Right.
the line that Jesus comes
Right. This
through.
is the lineage of Christ. That's right.
He
Exactly.
also had harlots on that.
It's an
bloodline.
interesting bloodline of people that
That's
God
true.
wove
I thought
together.
about that.
One, like
David wasn't one of them.
Ruth, his grandmother,
or lots of wives.
wasn't even a Jewish woman. She was a Moabite, and so
Right.
there was an interesting bloodline there that God used to weave together.
Yes.
But it was so it's not that it was perfectly clear all the way through, but God certainly used that bloodline to bring Jesus through. That's right. All right, number 2,
Okay.
Sherry.
What does Jonathan give David as a pledge or covenant? He talks about he gives him his robe, his armor, his sword, his bow and his belt,
Okay.
all the,
Protection.
protection, anointing, personality, or
Kingly identified.
kingly identity.
It's the outward things that identified him as royalty, right? Those are the things. He was the only one who had a sword. His bow was probably far greater than anyone else's. We'll talk about it in a later chapter, that his bow, he was amazing with the bow. His armor, we know that an Israelite person, the normal Israelite person, did not have armor. And so all of that would have been his kingly garments, his robe. Those would have been things that would have identified him as something unique and different. And he took those off and gave them to David, so that David could absorb that outward identification, but also even to a second degree as an outward identification, but also because it was what? It was part of this covenant, this covenant that David and Jonathan create, that they'll reiterate here coming up in our next chapter, that they continue to speak about, that becomes stronger than a blood covenant, or a covenant in those days was far greater than just a promise. We can break a promise pretty easy today. That was not something, it was upon life. You're pledging your life when you make these type of covenants. And this was an outward sign of this inward covenant that David and Jonathan had made, that's going to be so important as we go down through some chapters and see the story unfold a little bit more.
Well, and in the word, the use of robes, there's Joseph's robe and Christ's robe, and there's a thread, again, that makes robes really important.
An outward sign, right. We talked about when the prodigal son returns, the father saying, bring out the robe, show this outward sign of honor and prestige. Absolutely. All right, number 3.
Okay. David begins to gain a reputation. What is it? He gains a reputation for being a faithful protector.
Okay, a faithful protector of
the people.
That's right. So a successful military leader, he becomes well known for that, doesn't he? It says God gave him great success in those areas. Number 4, Mandy?
I guess. Why did the song that the people sang about David anger King Saul, and what does that tell you about him? Well, the song was Saul's killed his thousands, David his 10,000s.
Right.
And Saul was offended because it made David sound better than him, and he felt demeaned, and he was jealous.
There you go. There you
And
go.
angry.
There you go. And we know that that Saul changes that way because there's a certain event that happens. What is it? God no longer, the Spirit of God.
Oh, yeah.
Left him.
Yeah, the spirit left him.
It leaves him, and so everything about Saul changes, doesn't it? We see a huge change in his personality and how he
Kinda like
behaves.
Cain.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, number 5.
How do Saul's feelings about David change? Well, at first Saul found him quite useful.
Yes.
And then now Saul wants to get rid of David.
Yes. Yeah, isn't that amazing? He wanted to keep him around him all the time at first. Now he's looking for ways to take him out. So, yeah. All right, number 6.
And the Spirit of the Lord has now left Saul, and what takes over instead, and what types of things does Saul do? Well, the evil spirits of God take over, and he tries to kill David twice by hurling a spear at him, and Saul tries to pin David to the wall, so that was the 2 times. So
Okay.
Then, let me see over here if I have anything else. I think that's it.
What did you say about Saul prophesying?
The prophesying of Saul, okay, so if he's prophesying with a distressing spirit or an evil spirit or a demonic spirit, depending on what translation you're reading from, it's not necessarily of God. We're going to see that occur again here coming up, and God is going to use it as a judgment, actually, and he's going to use it as a tool to help David escape. They're going to be prophesying, but this prophesying isn't the way we think about it, like Ezekiel and Isaiah and those. It's a form of madness or a bipolar kind of behavior that you might have someone who's mad. be able to have. Now, the one thing you said is you said an evil spirit of God. Isn't that what you said? I think that perhaps the God, we need to be just a little bit clearer in saying that God sends
Yes.
that evil spirit. So it is of God in the fact that God still rules and reigns over the demonic spirits.
Right.
He still has far more power than they do, and he can allow them to come or go. But it's a distressing spirit that God allows to come and take over
Absolutely.
that. Yep.
Can I ask what the origin of this word is, distressing?
Distressing?
Yeah, what kind would that be? You know,
I'm not sure what you're asking.
What?
In Hebrew, it's ra, and it can mean evil, but it can also mean distressing, disappointing, disillusion. It's
okay.
much broader than just evil.
Yes.
And so the different-
NIV chose to use evil. Other
Okay.
ones pick a lot softer.
Or demonic, depending on, that can be used. I mean, there's a lot of ways that that it's described in there. I'm not sure why distressing
but even
is picked.
discouraging. It could be just something that he's
Yeah,
unhappy
it's a
with
negative
the
aspect.
situation.
There
Yeah.
you go.
Is
There
what?
you go.
Negative.
A negative
Okay.
aspect. All right, and so the types of things that Saul does, Mom talks about, told us some of the specifics. He's angry, he's jealous, he's what else? He's suspicious. Remember, it says he started watching everything that David did. He's even capable of murder. Those are all things that
Scared for his throne.
he's yeah,
Insecure.
insecure. Good word. Yeah,
He's always been insecure.
he has, hasn't he?
Well,
He's-
he
he's-
always has been a little bit on the edge because he had David come in to begin with to play the harp to soothe him.
Yeah.
So he was a little high strung. That's a good word.
a high maintenance kind of guy.
to
Is that a
begin
pun?
with.
Yeah.
You know, so when he was losing control, and his family his son was not going to be the king.
Yeah.
Of course, he just
Well, we're
went
just,
over the
and we're
edge.
going to see Saul continue to take that downward slide. He just goes from bad to worse, and so we're going to see examples of that as we go along. All right, number 7.
It is interesting that in spite of everything, Saul was afraid of David. Why? What does he do because of his fear? Under Satan's influence, Saul feared David would take his throne from him by force and popular demand. Unable to control the situation, he suffered from rages and distorted, inaccurate thinking, which leads him to seek David's life as a solution to his own misconceptions.
Perfect. That's exactly right. So he's that insecurity is coming out in a big time way, isn't it? Yeah. All right, number 8.
There aren't enough hearts.
Saul tricks David by saying that he will be giving Saul's daughter Merab. How does David respond? And David said, "Who am I, that I should be the son-in-law to the king?"
Okay. We talked about there would be several reasons. First of all, this shows David's what?
Humility.
His humbleness, his humility. Yep. Right, and he says, "I'm not worthy." He's also, we know David doesn't have a lot of money,
A real
right?
list.
A dowry for a princess is probably quite high, and David knows that he's not going to be able to pay anything near that. So, so we see that, and then number 9, a follow up to that.
Well, I didn't get that far, but the question seems to be pretty easy. It said, now Saul decides that David should be given his daughter Michal instead. How did Michal feel about that? And I assume she was really happy about it because she was in love with
There you
David.
go. Yeah, she loved David. He knew about that, and he decides to give. First of all, I didn't finish up with number 8. That's my fault for not even putting it in here. But he doesn't end up with Merab, right? Because Saul decides kind of at the last minute, oh, I'm going to give her to someone else. And so David just kind of steps back.
She must feel great about
Yeah.
that.
Well, you know what? The women didn't have a lot of say back in
No,
those
they
days.
didn't.
Not a whole lot.
No.
And especially the daughters of a king. They could be given at a moment's notice for a peace treaty or any other reason that they needed to be given. And so the fact that Michal is in love with David is an added bonus for her. It wouldn't have mattered if she was in love with David. If Saul had chosen to give her, she would have gone with David. Had to go with David anyway.
Very telling that it never says David is in love with her.
Right, exactly, right. And so, And yeah, especially once we get a little further on and see some of Michael's reactions, it's interesting to think how David would have responded to that.
There's no mention, yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't have time, but I was wondering what the meaning of the names were.
Uh,
And Michael and.
Something about,
I don't have that information right now, sorry.
I just.
I
didn't have
did
time.
not look
something
that
to do
up,
with
and
a
I
stream, a dry stream or something.
Okay.
I did not look that up.
Enlightening.
And her her husband, as it turned out, married.
Didn't have it in the-
All right, let's go with number 10.
What is the catch in this deal, and what does David do about it? The catch is that he has to bring 100 foreskins from the Philistines,
There you go.
so David brought 200.
Okay. Very good. So he was asked as a dowry, just a little something, just bring me 100 foreskins of my enemy, the Philistines. And so,
So is this why God would call him a man of blood? Because these were given not because they're our enemy, but because, oh, you're buying a wife. So for your own personal gain, you're killing 200 men.
I don't know. That's a good thought. I don't know.
I mean, this isn't a declaration of war.
Right. It's interesting because, with his military prowess, David is going to be a man of blood many times over.
Yes.
He's also going to be a man of blood when he actually does literal murder outside of the military.
This is literal murder to say, I'm killing you so I can buy a wife.
It is, although these are the arch enemy of Israel and probably were open game always.
It's probably more Bathsheba's husband that he was called out for.
He was. There are other times.
Still, dad is dead.
It's a good point, but
And children.
I think military action was sort of looked at under a different scope than outside of it.
But they were given, when Saul says go kill because they're our enemy, that's to me a legitimate kill. But when the reason for this is not legitimate.
Although, let's look down at one of these other questions. Look at the next one, number 11. Where are we at?
What does the strange dowry represent? Well, Saul wanted vengeance on the enemy. It's a good way to do it.
Okay. Vengeance on the king's enemy, according to verse 25. That's why it's being done. So, in that sense, it is sort of a little military thing that he goes out and does because he's taking vengeance on the king's enemy, which I'm going to assume, although it's not written in here, don't you imagine that David did that a lot? Like at any option that he had to take out the king's enemies, that was his job, which is why he became such a strong military leader and killed his tens of thousands of the king's enemies. But I understand what you're saying. He's making a point here. I would guess that if he went out just into the general public and began to kill people for this purpose, it might be looked at a little differently than if it were the enemies of the king. I don't know.
You had mentioned last week too that he knew that he was going to have to kill him to get his foreskin.
Right.
So that was a good way to. That was where I got my answer from. Was that it was a good way to take those people out.
Yeah, these ones who were the king's
out.
enemy, and the Philistines throughout the entire book of Samuel will be the arch enemy of Israel, and David will fight them for the rest of his life, actually. So,
well, and I thought I had was David when he challenged Goliath talked about the uncircumcised,
right? Which was the most negative thing he could think of to say, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then this foreskin is a play, kind of, on that.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a lot of deep meanings to that, I'm sure. Ultimately, it comes down to this: no guy's going to give that up without fighting to the death. So that's a good way to know. That's a good way to know that you're going to have to literally kill them, not take off a thumb or a toe. Where maybe you could allow them to live and go on without that. So
to prove that they're really Philistines.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
True.
All right. Yes. All right, number 12.
Explain how David showed that God was with him and watched his every step. And how do you feel about the statement that we are immortal until God's purpose and timing on our life is complete? The first part of that, he was pleased
because he went out before the expired days. Even so, I assume that means he went out sooner than he had to, right?
Well, before the deadline.
Yeah, the deadline. That's what I'm
That
saying.
Saul
the due
had
date,
given.
before the due
Yes,
date.
yeah.
He went out, so that would tell me he was like he did when he met the giant. He went running out, so he was happy to go out.
Okay,
That's what I got out of. And he killed 200 men of
okay,
the Philistines instead of 100, and he brought back the foreskins, and he counted each one to the king.
okay.
And how do I feel about? Well, I feel like when it's our time, it's our time.
Yeah.
On
So-
the second part of that.
Right. Lori, we spent a little bit of time talking about the fact that it's kind of it was kind of a new thing for me when I first heard it, which I hadn't thought of necessarily, was the fact that we are actually immortal and cannot be killed until God's timing and purpose for our life is complete. And so we're going to see that with David, and how that's a difficult concept for us because of